Welcome back. We're talking about the rise of hate groups in America. Joining us from Philadelphia is Anthea Butler. She's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And with us here in Washington is counterterrorism expert William Braniff. Thanks again to both of you. Bill, that study by the Southern Poverty Law Center also showed that many of the hate groups in the United States are now resorting to the internet to make their views known. They can do so, according to this report, in relative anonymity. Because when they go public, they have found that in the past there is a price to pay for that. Now with the internet, they can spread their vitriol, they can spread this odious ideology without being identified.
It's true for all forms of extremism, and there's no reason to suggest that white supremacist or other right-wing extremist movements wouldn't also utilize the technology that other clandestine actors have sought to use, as well as other general Americans who want to maintain their anonymity and still engage in social media use. So there's a lot of people who appreciate the ability to have privacy online. Among them are clandestine actors who sometimes engage in illegal behavior. But it's absolutely true. The internet is a place where deviant behaviors can go and find like-minded individuals who exhibit similar behaviors and avoid a lot of the censure that we get in our face-to-face communication. If I say something really horrible to you right now, I'm going to look at your facial expression and know that I shouldn't have said that. Online, I get none of that negative feedback, and I just bounce my way right to the community of people that I might be looking to find who have these shared values. And so, unfortunately, this is something we have to address. And I'll tell you that it's a great challenge for the law enforcement community because they don't have the ability to see most of these encrypted conversations or communications, and they do attempt to respect civil rights and civil liberties in the process of their jobs. So this is a challenge.
Right, and Anthea, there is one group which openly propagates its ideology on the internet. They run a very large website, and I was reading about them, and it seems they have 300,000 registered users on this site. And on the internet, they rank around 13,300 in terms of popularity. Now, when you compare that against, say, a group like the NAACP, which ranks around 32,000. So here we have an extremist right-wing group that is far more popular on the internet than the NAACP, which is, a group that propagates the rights of black people in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that number at all. I mean, I think that one of the things we need to start to think about is if, I was listening to what Mr. Braniff said, if we could go after child pornography, through these kinds of sort of sting operations on the internet and pretend to be, 9-year-old children so that we can catch pedophiles, I think we could do the same thing with racists if we want to. But the question is, of course, is how much is free speech that's protected by the First Amendment, and how much of this might lead to some act like what Dylan Roof did in murdering 9 people in Charleston. That's the question, is that when does the talk go into intent? And I think that's the important part of what we need to think about. And also, just one more thing I think that's really important to bring up. I think that we need to talk about the other kinds of racial discourse that happens in this country that's not just on the deep, dark internet, but it's an everyday, you can turn on your television set. I think we have media outlets here that promulgate some of these beliefs, and that the everyday person who's sitting in their house who might not have thought these things 10 years ago can turn on certain cable outlets and be able to listen to this kind of drivel 24/7. And that makes it a lot easier for people, normal, everyday good people who might not feel this way to become, more radicalized because they hear the drumbeat of the same kind of things that they hear in the darker parts of the web.
I want to read you something that was in the British newspaper, The Guardian. It's an opinion piece, and I'd like to get both your opinions on this, but let me read the piece first. It says, "The massacre in Charleston was not just an isolated hate crime carried out by a mentally ill racist in South Carolina. It is simultaneously representative and starkly indicative of the rampant racism structurally embedded in America. This shooting was not an anomaly, but a manifestation of the violence cultivated in America towards black communities." First, you, Bill.
That's a difficult thing to respond to, and the reason is we've done studies. Dr. Peter Simi has interviewed 44 former white supremacists and asked them to do really long life history interviews. And the community of former white supremacists that he interviewed indicated that they had much higher levels of mental health issues, histories of high-risk behavior like drug and alcohol abuse, and child abuse in their history. That is part of the story here. It's not the whole story. There's also the aspects that this commentator has suggested. There are aspects of institutional racism in the United States. Our history has created legacies that we're still dealing with. So I don't want to say that it's one or the other.
Structurally embedded in America.
And I think that the two interact, that you have very personal stories and oftentimes personal psychology interfacing or overlaid with structural issues. And the pathway is created for someone to gravitate towards an extremist family that gives them the things that they need psychologically, but points them in all the wrong directions towards a violent output. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's one or the other. I think that it's the interplay of both in many cases.
Right. And Anthea, when they talk about structurally embedded, I mean, if we look at what happens, say, in the United States criminal justice system, we've had the spate of killings of black men by white policemen. If we just look at the criminal justice system, the number of black men per capita who are put in prison in this country has the highest prison population in the world. It's all there, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And while I would agree that mental health plays a part of this, I think that the hardest part for most people, including Mr. Braniff, to say is that America can be very racist. And I don't disagree with anything in the Guardian article at all. I mean, let me be very clear about that. I think that article is spot on. I think that person told the truth. I think that it is a very deep issue that we have to deal with. Let's talk about structural racism for a minute. Now, I want to use South Carolina as an example. The structural racism that is built in was built in that Confederate flag, which was hung up during the Civil Rights Movement to show the supremacy of the failed Confederate South and its racist beliefs. That flag flew yesterday as the coffin of the Reverend Pinckney came by to be laid in state in the state capitol. He is the first black person to lie in state in that state capitol in South Carolina since the Reconstruction period, probably ever. Okay, so when we begin to talk about the structural racism that is embedded in America, you can't divorce that from the state of racism that people may feel in their minds. That structural racism has bred the racism that is the psychological racism that he talks about. If you always think that there should be a white person in the White House, that you think that white people are better than black people and more intelligent, that they're better than immigrants that come into the country, then I will tell you that the structural racism that is built in America is also built upon white notions of white supremacy and how they think about themselves vis-a-vis other people groups.
And Bill, while researching this show, I came across some figures for, where this kind of racism, where the rise of right-wing groups are most prevalent. It's not in the South, as one would think. That would be kind of the conventional wisdom telling us, well, it's in the South. I mean, I looked at the top 5 states, and they are California, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania.
That's right. This is not a Southern issue. It's an American issue, and it's a, terrorism, extremism, these are human phenomena, and we are a majority white country, and so our largest form of extremism reflects our demographics. It's white supremacy and right-wing extremism, and it occurs in populous places where a lot of white people live. Again, not uniquely tied to the South.
And Anthea, I mean, when we look at the election of Barack Obama as the first black president in the country, I mean, it was thought, I guess, hopefully at the time, that this was a turning point for the United States insofar as race relations were concerned. But then when we look at the developments of South Carolina just this past week, we're very far away from that, aren't we?
Yes, we are. I think that's the fantasy of you thought that electing a black president was going to eliminate racism, because surely, if we could elect a black president, that meant racism was over, but it didn't. We're not a colorblind society. We see color everywhere. And what happened in Charleston was a horrible thing, But I hope it's woken up for people who have been asleep and would like to pretend that racism doesn't exist in America. And I want to point out one thing that Mr. Braniff said. I do think that one of the reasons why the uptick is happening because the demographics are changing. While, we're almost at a place right now where we're close to 50% white, 50% other in America because of immigration, other people who live here. So when that demographic begins to change in, say, 2020 or 2040, what will happen? If we don't address racism now, then when whites become the minority in the United States, how will they then feel? What will happen next? If they're the majority right now, as you say, Mr. Braniff, then we have a serious problem to think about in the coming years, don't we?
I think it's a great point. Most of the right-wing flavors of extremism in the United States are reactionary or status quo forms of extremism, unlike what we see with the violent jihadist camps, which are revolutionary. They're trying to overthrow the existing system. White supremacists in the United States, anti-immigration activists, extremists in the United States are fighting against the erosion of their privileged place in society. They're trying to maintain the status quo, which they think is appropriate because of some sort of supremacist ideology. And so I think that it's an excellent point that changing demographics is a force to be reckoned with. It's a force of nature, quite literally, and it will generate these kinds of reactionary responses like we've just seen in the tragedy.
William Braniff, Anthea Butler, thanks to both of you for joining us.